Welcome to the first panel, Entrepreneurship and Innovation. While the utility of Turkey's political model as a source of emulation for the broader Middle East region may now be in dispute, the success of its economic model, as we just heard, ladies and gentlemen, is undeniable and indisputable. In 1 decade, Turkey has managed to transform itself from an economic basket case to a powerhouse. The speakers did a fantastic job in briefly reviewing Turkey's economic accomplishments in the course of the last 10 years, but let me just succinctly and briefly mention that it has managed to triple its GDP per capita. It has expanded substantially the size of its middle class. It has taken enormous strides in alleviating poverty. And it has had very respectable rates of economic growth, but not just economic growth, but growth with equity. So very much unlike the other countries of the Middle East, ladies and gentlemen, Turkey has uniquely managed to achieve many of the goals of development. Now, it is important for all of us to remember that in 2001, actually as recently as the 1990s, Turkey was referred to as the 1990s in Turkey were referred to as the lost decade. The level of foreign direct investment in Turkey was minuscule. Even up until 2004, Turkey managed to attract only $580 million per annum. And the country was beset with persistently high levels of inflation, high interest rates, high unemployment, and anemic growth. I think I read recently that in the 1990s, Bermuda and Sudan managed to attract greater foreign direct investment than Turkey did. So, and thereafter in 2001, Turkey had its own version of an economic collapse with bank failures, currency devaluation, hyperinflation, recession, prolonged recession, verging on depression. And amazingly, it has managed to extricate itself from all of these difficulties and become an economic powerhouse. So the purpose of this panel, ladies and gentlemen, is to discover what went right in Turkey. Not what went wrong, but what went right. How did they do it? How did they bring about this astonishing turnaround? And we would also like to examine the extent to which Turkey could potentially serve as a source of emulation. Mr. IG said that Turkey does not aspire to be a model for the rest of the region, but to what extent can it serve as a source of emulation for the broader Middle East? And which aspects of Turkey's model of development, especially in the course of the last 10 years, could be borrowed and adapted in the surrounding areas? Now, to do all of these things, I am very happy to report that we have managed to put together a fantastic panel for you, beginning with Mr. Abdullah Celik, who is joining us from Istanbul. Mr. Celik is working as a coordinator for subsidiaries and foreign business development issues in Bank Asya, Asia. And he had previously served as the CEO of Bank Asya. He is one of the successful financiers in Turkey and one of the people who has been personally responsible for the rise of Turkey in the last 10 years. So he can give us a important glimpse into the causes behind the success of Turkey, both from a macroeconomic perspective and also from a microeconomic perspective. And we are also very fortunate to have Jeff Gedmin from the Legatum Institute in London. Prior to becoming the president and CEO of the Legatum Institute, Jeff served as the president and CEO of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And Jeff will have a very interesting perspective and insight into not just the economic prosperity of Turkey and not just the rise in the standard of living that has undeniably taken place in Turkey in the last 10 years, but he will help to put the rise of Turkey into regional perspective as well as historical perspective and conceptual perspective by looking at not just standards of living but also quality of life. Changes that have taken place in the quality of life in Turkey with some comparative analysis drawn from the Middle East region. And last but certainly not least, Ahmad Abdulkader is joining us today. We're fortunate to have him. He has come from Seattle to talk about the microeconomic components and requisites for economic development and economic growth. Ahmad is a partner architect and development manager in Microsoft Corporation, and he heads the Center of Excellence on Machine Learning and Big Data at Microsoft. And Ahmad is going to enlighten us about the indispensable role of research and development in promoting innovation and entrepreneurship, even under conditions which may be construed as being unpropitious, political, economic conditions that could be unpropitious. Nonetheless, from the micro level, there could be movement and development of entrepreneurship, which is indispensable for generating jobs and growth, which are key to the all of the countries of the region. So without further ado, let me turn first to Mr. Celik and ask him to enlighten us about the Turkish experiment.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for being here to speak on these matters, on these issues today. Good morning, you all. Before me, many speakers generally mentioned about and gave some general idea of what was going on in Turkey during last decade. Actually, before we came to this last decade, 2001, as you mentioned, 90s were like a lost decade for us. Very short periods of coalition governments actually was the main reason. Weak governments and not very, sound and long-term decisions could not be taken in terms of economy, not only in terms of economy, but in all aspects of the life in Turkey. We came to 2000 after this period of weak governments and I should say not a very good management of country, and in exact terms we hit the bottom in the 2000s. We had our financial crisis, which is worse than this global financial crisis in 2000 and 2001, and this hitting the bottom maybe helped us to think about what's going on in Turkey and how we should correct these things and how we should proceed. Actually, the main problems that time appeared in banking sectors, assets, in financial sector, as we had the biggest problems. Actually, it was the results of other developments, other things that were not correct. They all included somehow in the bank's balance sheets. We had very big losses actually, or I should say hidden losses in the bank's balance sheets, both in public banks or both in private banks. Public banks, the other governments in 90s, during 1990s, they didn't have money for some kind of, let's say, public for expenditures, and they used public banks, and these losses were there hidden. And the other private banks, they were not working very well in a profitable manner, but they were in the system anyway, and they with the very high inflation and high interest rates, these banks were not working in a profitable manner. And we came to 2000 and 2001 like this, and as I said, we hit the bottom. And what we do after 2001, we had a very extensive restructuring program in financial sector, also in other sectors. What is the other sector? The other sectors is basically the government finances, the public finance, and also in the monetary policies. We had to take serious measures. What we did in the financial sector, we closed. We reduced the number of banks from around more than 70s to 40s. So almost close to half of the banks is closed. And another things in the public sector, we put a target which is 6.5% of the GDP. How should I say it? we should create a surplus over the interest expenses equal to 6.5% of GDP every year. So we should reduce the level of public debt. This was the target in 2001. Actually, these targets were, after year and year, proved to be working very well. Maybe I should give you more information about the also the these independent bodies created to manage the banking sector. Actually, I was working in the BRSI, called Bank Regulation and Supervision Agency that time. This agency is formed, which is responsible for the whole aspects of banks, from giving the initial license to closing decisions. So before, the decisions about the banks were given by the politicians, actually. And can you imagine how politicians can give the decisions about the banks? For example, you should say to a bank that, okay, you should withdraw from these risks, and some kind of measures should be taken, and you should get from the authorization of a minister for this. Can you imagine? And this system, of course, didn't work before 2000. But after 2001, after Bank Regulation and Supervision Agency is formed, all the decisions about all the banks could be given under one roof, from the licensing to the closing. This also proved to be very well after for supervision and the regulation of the banks, and protected them from this global financial crisis. The restructuring of financial sector consisted from either closing the weak bank or recapitalizing them for the private banks. For the state banks, also recapitalized, special government bonds were issued for them, which replaced the huge duty losses stemming from government assigned subsidies I mentioned. After these measures were taken, with a great use of public money, of course, actually it is around 30% of GDP that time. We had more stable financial system with less number of banks, which I mentioned, which were carefully supervised in terms of risks taken by them, with the lesson of 2001 crisis in mind during the whole decade and onwards. The results on the bank's balance sheets were remarkable, actually. Banking sector in 2012 was 6.3 times bigger compared to 2001. The increase in loans was more prominent. Loans outstanding in 2012 was 15.4 times greater than that of 2001. Bad loans, on the other hand, after provisions, was the same as 2001, which is astonishing. After the years, which show how strong Turkish banking sector became and came up from this crisis. After 2001, banking sector was not the only sector which was going under restructuring. The government public finances, as I mentioned, also improved considerably during that term. Here I'd like to give some numbers about how public finance improved during that term. The ratio of interest payment expenses to the tax income went down from 86% in 2002 to only 17% in 2012. I want to repeat this. The interest expense, the ratio of interest expense to tax income was 86% in 2002, but only 17% in 2012, which explains how we can spend so much money in education, healthcare, and in other parts of the economy. If you don't spend, I can also give you the figures for the amount of money, how much interest expense we spent in the budget. In 2002, it was 50 billion Turkish lira. In 2012, again, it's 50 billion Turkish lira. It didn't change at all. But during this time, as my friends explained, economy has grown 5% every year on the average. So Turkish government public finances of course increased dramatically during that time, and we had sources or for which were available for other uses like economy, education and healthcare and others, which also help, of course, to alleviate the poverty and improve the people's lives in Turkey. This also enabled banks to give more credit to the private sector. High growth rates of the Turkish economy with less number of banks after restructuring, of course, enabled banks to work in profitable manner, which gave them necessary capital for growing even further. During this term, capital adequacy ratio of banking sector was never less than 16%, which is the ratio as of July 2013. And this is a remarkable number. Who knows about these capital adequacy issues? It is very high number. During the same term, average return on equity in banking sector was 17.8%. I give you these numbers to explain how the healthy growth of the credit, also the growth of the capital of the banks could be possible. Without a healthy banking sector, profitable banking sector, they wouldn't have this capital for the healthy profit growth. Healthy credit growth, as I explained. I should say healthy growth of banking sector is also very essential for financing the growth of the economy and the entrepreneurship. As I mentioned earlier, as the government borrowing more funds became available for the private sector. The ratio of net public sector debt to GDP went down to 36% in 2012 from 74% in 2002. This is also the crowding out effect we all know. As the government sector borrowing less and less, more money became available for the private sector, which also helped the economy and the entrepreneurship and the companies to grow even more. In Turkey, banks' main distribution channel is the branches. Total number of branches of all the banks in Turkey is close to 11,000. In every branch, they have a sales agent responsible for SME loans, commercial loans, retail loans. They make initial contact with the customer, these sales agents, the branches can extend credit within, they have a limit, certain limit which they extend credit. Credits with higher limits can also be extended by regional offices, which is responsible for 20-25 branches. This structure of the banking makes them give faster credits with local information. SMEs are this structure benefit SMEs, small companies, very much, which also help the small companies benefiting from this credit growth. Here I should also mention that in Turkey, geographically, not only Istanbul, but also other many cities in the Anatolia, in Kayseri, Gaziantep, who are familiar with Turkey, many cities started to become producing. They had their SMEs, then their SMEs become larger and larger, start exporting. They also benefited from this development. Why? Because the credit decisions in Turkey are not centrally or in headquarters. Okay, banks use some kind of models, some statistical measures, statistical tools. Okay, but they also have their branches, their regional offices, and they give credit decisions locally, which also benefited these small companies very much. Another very important development during the last decade in Turkey was privatization of major state companies. This not only improved governance in the public sector, but also enabled other private investments in these sectors, which were afraid to compete with public companies before. Because a private company does not want to work in a sector where a public company is prominent, because they are afraid that public companies might not always have the profitability decision in their mind. They sometimes might willingly incur losses, and so you cannot compete with a public company who uses public money. So after the privatization, both the foreign investments, also in the investors from Turkey, started building businesses in those sectors as well. Many big government infrastructures investments is completed through BOT, build, operate, transfer contracts. This is another important development in Turkey I'd like to mention. All the airport terminals in major cities was built with BOT contracts. This proved to be beneficial in many ways. The construction periods were very short and the costs were low. Because the construction is made by private companies, banks were making new businesses by giving guarantees to government and loans for construction, and operating companies also benefiting as the owner of the operation. BOT structure worked very well to increase entrepreneurship and the private initiative in Turkey. All the government was doing actually was giving the contract, and all the other things are taking care of the private sector, and which is perfect, like, right? Private companies finding the money, doing the financing, building the project, terminals, everything, and they operating it. They even giving the tax, so which is actually proved to be very nice in Turkey now, a very widely used system. They renewed all the airline terminals, airport terminals in Turkey. They are now building a bridge, on a new bridge in Turkey with this system. Okay. To sum it up, we can say that the success of Turkish economy is built on a strong financial sector, but many right moves also made in the government sector, like privatization, controlling public borrowing, and the increasing private sector share in the economy. These factors not only protected Turkish economy from the global financial crisis of 2009, but also helped it to create 3.2 million jobs after the crisis. Thank you.
very much.
Well, Dariush, thank you, and good morning to everybody. I'm going to, if I may, step back a little bit. As I understand, a point of the panel, but also of today's conversations, is to think a little bit about Turkey and the Middle East, about lessons learned, about models, and offer you, in my view, some framework or maybe points of orientation to consider some of the questions that are going to be raised. First of all, it seems to me that if one starts with the Middle East side of the equation, that any region or any country going through a revolution or a dramatic change tends to have three things in common. And I think this is pretty much what the global record shows. I've experienced two more or less live, one in Berlin when communism fell in East Germany in 1989, and then again in Cairo, at least the days after Mubarak fell. The three things that seem to me are in common in these dramatic revolutionary or post-revolutionary situations are, number one, this unbelievable feeling of exhilaration and euphoria. And those of you who have witnessed or experienced know what I'm talking about. And in virtually every case that I know of, even though there may have been economic hardship and desire for a better standard of living, it's not the mood of the moment. The mood of the moment is almost invariably about dignity. People feel like a great humiliation has been ended, and it's an unbelievable feeling, moment, atmosphere, and euphoria. The second thing, minds quickly do turn to matters of economics, and expectations are enormously challenging. And I think for any governing class or post-regime government, managing expectations is just exceptionally difficult. And related to that, one sees the emergence of popular narratives of what happened, why, and how to fix things. And I recall, if I can keep those two examples married for a second, though different they are, in East Germany, the popular narrative that emerged very quickly among East Germans was, we know what we've shed, and now West Germany will solve it. We'll have subsidies and wealth transfer, and we will go quickly to a society which drives Mercedes and vacations in Mallorca. And of course, it didn't happen that way, or it didn't happen that way immediately. In the case of post-Mubarak Egypt, I remember hearing so frequently in the days after his fall from taxi drivers and waiters and professors and government officials, Mubarak stole all this money, 10 billion, 35 billion, 70 billion, all the estimates. Don't worry, as soon as we find it, we will distribute it, and everything will be okay. Because there's so much money there, we just have to share it around. And it doesn't quite work like that either. How does it work then? 2 points I would share with you for general observations about nations in transit, if you will. The first is there's been an explosion over the last quarter of a century in policy research and in academic research on how we think about models and how we measure things. And it's enormously helpful. There's a story that may be apocryphal, but nevertheless useful, about Milton Friedman once being asked by a student, Professor Friedman, what do we do about those things that you just can't measure? And Professor Friedman, Milton Friedman, apparently said, well, you measure them anyway. And it's certainly the case that in the last couple decades, we measure virtually everything. First of all, we like comparing. We like looking at history. We know that South Africa isn't Chile, and Chile isn't the Philippines, and Poland isn't Egypt, but we love, and Turkey is not Egypt, and Egypt is not Tunisia, but we love comparing the death out of these things. And I think for good reason, because we get some sense of what's different, at least, and then maybe some insight of what's in common. Of course, also in measuring, we have an explosion in the last really few years of indexes or indices. Probably one of the oldest that's being used today is Freedom House's index that looks at political rights and civil liberties. And then you have Transparency International that looks at issues of corruption. There's something now published in Seattle called the Rule of Law Index, which looks at the rule of law. In 1990, the UN got into the game with its Human Development Report and Index that was more inclusive and started looking at things like health and education. I run an institute, as Dariush said, in London, the Legatum Institute, that publishes something called the Prosperity Index, which, I'll hold it up for a second. This is the executive summary that looks at countries with 8 sub-indices and 88 variables and tries to look at virtually everything one could reasonably think of in one single index. I've counted that in the last 6 years, about 22 new indexes have been produced by academic institutions, financial institutions, and banks, and they all lend something. They all have some value. Now, what have we learned at the level of generality? Well, at least 8 things, which are not new to anybody in this room, but I think bear observation repeating, that countries that tend to be successful have certain things in common, like rule of law, property rights, market economy that is open with clear and transparent rules and competition that's fair, independent judiciary, decent accountable government, free competitive press, social capital, a sense of cohesion and community, and of course safety and security. It's kind of intuitive. If you look at our index, for example, our prosperity index, the top 30 countries in the world tend to be, I think 28 of the 30, are electoral democracies with market economies and peace at home. It's intuitive. The bottom 30 tend to be either authoritarian regimes or regimes in turmoil or civil war. It's not the greatest of rocket science, I suppose. But I guess the observation or conclusion I'd make about the first point is there's lots that we can measure. There's lots of measuring to be done. And in terms of guidance or points of orientation or a way of thinking about these things, I think it's useful. Incidentally, in our index, the new edition 2013, to be published in 2 weeks, we have Turkey climbing up in general, good scores in economics and entrepreneurship and opportunity, and declining scores in government and personal freedom. Second point, final point I want to make, the second. If Milton Friedman said, if you can't measure it anything, measure it anyway, there's another free market economist of the 20th century, an Austrian named Friedrich Hayek, who apparently was once asked by a student, Professor Hayek, if you can't measure it, what do you do? And Hayek said, be humble and don't show a pretense of knowledge. There's certain things we just can't know. I think to this point, I'd say that as much as we've learned about describing, and Dariush, I think more precise thinking about measures and models and who should emulate whom, the bloody part and problem of it is development is still not an engineering problem. I mean, if it were, life would be so much easier. I think we Americans found that out in Iraq and Afghanistan. And to the overlay of the things that I've described, these characteristics or attributes that seem to be drivers of prosperity, and by implication or extrapolation you can figure out what the restraints on prosperity are. The overlay is culture, of course, and those things that we all know about but tend to time and again underestimate. That's history, and it's religion, and it's ethnicity, and nationalism, and narratives, national narratives of grievance or victimhood or superiority. It's individual and also collective habits and values and behaviors. Anybody who has run a company or an organization, not even to get into countries, knows that it's easier to change structure and the institution itself than it is to change culture and habits and values and behaviors. that change so incredibly slowly. Of course, we know this from recent history. I started with 1989 and the fall of communism, and everybody discovered very quickly that Poland is not East Germany, and the Baltic nations are not the Balkan states. And then when we had the Arab Spring, people said, it's 1989 again in the Middle East. And then we realized it's not exactly 1989, and even among the Middle Eastern nations, each country had its own challenge or departure point or our own national narrative, and none of those were Turkey either. I think I'd sum it up this way. My second point doesn't suggest that we should throw up our hands and say, well, therefore, it's kind of hopeless. I think it's the balance of the two. It's managing expectations, and it's somehow figuring out how to ask the right questions. Now, I've dodged Dariush's challenge. I'm not giving you any answers at all. I'm just going to suggest that we ponder what the right questions are to be asked during the course of the day. Number one, always be empirical. I think any kind of public policy decision making must responsibly rely on data, history, and evidence. I think number two, we want to use history always. We want to use comparative research always. But we also have to think exactly what we're looking for in using history and comparison and what we're not looking for. You know, this expression by Mark Twain, who once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. I think we're looking for the rhymes, you know, the hints, the clues, the patterns, but not the answers or not the formulas. I'll leave you with this very last thought. I've got a colleague in London named Anne Applebaum, who some of you may have heard of. She's a journalist, she's a historian, she's a Washington Post columnist. She's also married to the foreign minister of Poland, Monik Sikorski. I sat 2 days ago, Thursday, in a meeting in London with Anne and some business leaders, one of whom asked her, when it comes to development, what's your theory of change? And she said, good God, that's what Marxists did, theory of change. I've spent my whole life rejecting theories of change. I'm interested in pragmatism suited to particular circumstances. And I thought that was a nice way to put it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thanks to Dariush for introducing me. Thanks to Dr. Osama Hassanin of TechWadi for inviting me to engage with this great crowd. Very happy to be here to share my perspective about innovation and how it can help growth. Thanks to the speakers who started before me. Jeff, I can totally relate to your argument about being data-driven and analyzing data and being empirical actually about making decisions. I think it's maybe one of the themes I'm going to talk about. I'm also very happy to hear somebody say indexes instead of indices. I went to British schools. Totally. So my name is Ahmad Abdulkader. I'm from, I work at Microsoft. I'm an Egyptian American. I studied in Canada and the US. I lived in Seattle for some time. I actually do live in the Bay Area these days, but I go to Seattle a lot, so people think that I live in Seattle, but I live in the Bay Area. I live in Los Gatos. So the points I want to make today I'm not an expert on Turkey. I admire the Turkish model quite a bit, but I'm not really an expert on Turkey. I'm going to share with you my perspective about innovation. What is actually innovation, and does it really actually relate to economic growth or growth in general? Is that true? What actually exactly is innovation? And maybe share with you some case study about the Microsoft Cairo Innovation Center. And this is not a plug for Microsoft. This is just one example that I know about that I would like to share with you. Okay. So wrong direction. All right. So there's this this theory. It's one of the oldest models about innovation. It's as early as 1940s. People cannot even trace who came up with this model. Some people attribute it to Bush, 1945. Some people dispute that. It basically is saying, this is a linear process that sort of innovation or research actually goes through, and it's actually an attempt to make a change in sort of society or change, in the economy. It goes through these processes, sort of linear process, if you will, through basic research, abstract research, inventing or coming up with new concepts or new theories about things. And then it goes through a phase of applied research, where the abstract concepts are, applied to certain particular problems, and problems are solved or shown to be solved. Then it goes through development, where sort of engineers take over and start developing working solutions. Then it goes to production, and then it starts impacting people's lives and the economy and society in general. Now, nobody alive right now actually believes this model, but it has defied all criticism. Statistics agree with it quite a bit. People who live in the U.S. may have, it was very amusing to see how Governor Romney was criticizing, President Obama for his investments in new technologies, and President Obama's arguments that, investing in, Solar City and, some solar startups and Tesla and stuff like that. This is the vehicle of growth. This is how we're actually going to. So many people believe this model works, and it sort of defied sort of time, and statistics agree with it. Example is China. Here's, I'm quoting a study here done by some researchers in China that shows actually that the R&D spend as a percentage of GDP, it's not just correlating. And people who know a little bit about statistics know there's a distinction between correlation and causality. But they actually did their job and examined the causality relationship between R&D spend as a percentage of the GDP and economic growth, and they showed actually that there is, if you look at the last bullet, to make such a statement, this is a very, very profound statement. To make a statement like that, an R&D expenditure increased by 1% will directly, can cause, a GDP increase of 0.9%. This is very, very profound, right? And there's data to substantiate that part. China, as you can see, like until 2007, this is old data, of course, but I presume, extrapolating the numbers will be much higher than this. But until 2007, their R&D GDP spend is about 1.5%. I'm guessing right now it should be in the 2% range. Typically, these numbers range, for countries who do spend on R&D, ranges between 2 to 3%. Turkey, I think, in 2012, it was 0.8% or something like that. In the Middle East, other than Egypt and Saudi Arabia, I think Egypt's is like 0.2%. The highest actually in the world is Israel. Israel is about 4.5%, remarkably high, much higher even than the US. US spends more like between 2 or 2.5%, but countries like Germany, Finland spend in the range of 3%. So, there are many people who firmly believe that, spending on R&D directly actually impacts sort of growth. So I think there is a very strong case for that, and I personally think it's true. So what exactly is actually innovation? Yeah, it's sort of one of these subjective sort of concepts, but let's try to sort of define it. Many people have attempted to do so. So it's basically finding knowledge that no one had already had in their possession before, something novel about it. Or it's a new look or understanding of something that already exists, okay, which would yield better solutions for it in the long term. And at the heart of actually innovative work, there's sort of an attitude or a sort of a cultural sort of change, if you will. The spirit of accepting or being comfortable with something dramatically changing or changing your views about things, which is related to culture and habits and even proverbs that people quote and use all the time. And challenging the status quo. This all comes along with sort of innovation. And it's actually interesting to see if such a, you're studying the sort of, talking about Turkish model, whether these sort of trends started happening, in society or not. Conformance, like, Middle Eastern societies are known to be collective societies, not individualistic societies, where maybe being unique and different is sort of maybe not celebrated or even criticized. Challenging the status quo may not be very, very acceptable. So to what extent do these traditions or heritage, if you will, is sort of constraining us? Something that we sort of need to look at. As I said, so the sense of sort of adventure, sort of challenging the existing sort of status quo in sort of innovation. It's really interesting, the examples that I've seen, in Egypt in particular, where I'm, following closely what's happening and traveling there a lot. When people or institutions or organizations that sort of attempt to do some R&D or sort of take on the sort of R&D, in many cases people literally sort of end up looking at the literature, looking at the common problems in a particular field, let's say computer science or something of the sorts, and then started pursuing the well-known problems that, guess what, have been coined and defined by sort of first world countries. So for example, the US is obsessed with automation, for example, problems like, in my domain, problems like speech recognition or computer vision and stuff like that is very, very, very important. Now, do we care, or does a third world economy care about automation as such? So, many times we just follow, the West in general sort of ends up coining or defining the problems, and we pay very, very little sort of attention or have very little contribution in defining these problems, and we just follow suit. So unfortunately, reasonable percentage of the R&D that sort of happens in sort of, at least in Egypt and some countries, is not homegrown. It's actually, sort of the state of the art, if you will. And it's, yes, there are great contributions by individuals over there, but it may actually not serve the societies over there. There are examples, of course. I'm not claiming that it accounts for. But just to give an example, this lady, Susan, I hope I'm pronouncing the name, Ogiwa, in Kenya, she created an SMS app, which these days is considered low tech, right? No internet, no connectivity. That basically allows farmers to be aware of the prices of crops sort of every day. And this would help them a lot in sort of the business deals that they do and planning for their for agriculture and stuff like that. It was really a big hit and quite successful. She has many other projects. This is a very good example of a homegrown. It's very low tech, but it does serve and solve a need. We have chronic problems in countries in public transportation, in nutrition, in education, in healthcare, that are just waiting for innovative solutions. These may not be problems that exist in the first world. So I argue that we should be focusing on innovations and research and development in areas like that, rather than follow what's referred to as the state of the art. And there are many low-hanging fruit. I know a bunch of investors who are looking into innovative solutions for public transportation solutions in Egypt, and it can be very profitable. Has definitely a huge social impact, and can have very profound impact on growth. Same thing for medical care. Same thing for education. So finally, I want to give you a bright example. What started with something called the Cairo Microsoft Innovation Center, now called Advanced Technology Lab in Cairo. It was actually established in 2005, and its mission statement is basically pursue innovations that it's totally pragmatic for Microsoft to bring the Microsoft technologies closer to the masses in the region. Microsoft saw huge opportunities, big opportunities for it in the region, and they are not explored. And creating innovation centers like that can help quite a bit. I think I missed a slide. Oops. There, just I think it's not there. So Microsoft actually had a deal with the government where it committed to spending a certain percentage of its income in Egypt towards the establishment of a technology or advanced technology center in Egypt. This happened in 2005. And this was before the revolution. It was Dr. Ahmed Nazif's government at that time. And it's sort of a win-win situation. I mean, the more Microsoft sells in the region, the more it's going to invest. And the government, at least the public statements back then, was really interested in promoting technology and R&D in the region. And it was quite successful, actually, venture. So now, as of today, there's a team of 42 applied researchers and engineers and research assistants with many programs. With quite an impact actually on Microsoft products and on the community over there, be it the academic community, be it actually universities, or actually just the software market over there. Their main, basically, they hire engineers, they hire scientists from top universities in the world, engineers from Microsoft and from other high-tech companies in Silicon Valley, and actually hire graduates of Egyptian universities. They also ended up sponsoring many undergraduate and graduate programs that basically help graduate, engineers and scientists that would be good hires for that center. So it's quite a successful model. Here, I think the slide that I missed talk about the technologies that they actually specialize in. But I cast that as actually a successful model that could be repeated. And it was done irrespective of the political climate over there. So there are ways, despite the sometimes gloomy picture, a gloomy political sort of landscape, there are still ways to actually have an impact. And as I said, there's low-hanging fruit there, be it for investors or people who care about having an impact in sort of these regions. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, to all of you for your very illuminating presentations. I will just ask one question and then we open it up to, do we have time, Ali?
You don't, unfortunately. You can ask one question only because you are the director of the program.
Okay, thank you. So Jeff very wisely reminded us that we are dealing with social science and not natural science. And therefore, even though we would like to emulate the model of the natural scientists and to come up with simple generalizations. These generalizations do not apply universally, and we have to be attuned and cognizant of unique circumstances and cultures. So based on that observation, I would like to pose a question to the panel. Abdullah, you eloquently explained to us all of the factors that have been responsible for the Turkish economic growth in the course of the last 10 years, including privatization, macroeconomic stabilization, bank reform, extension of credit, and so on and so forth. But you didn't talk about the role of culture in Turkey's economic success. So what do you think, all of you gentlemen? What has been the role of culture? And when it comes to Turkey, we have heard about Islamic Calvinists, or the so-called Anatolian tigers. What role do you ascribe to culture? Now, granted that culture by itself is not sufficient if the other conditions are not there, but I would be curious to know your thoughts on that question.
I think on this point I should say that in Turkey we have this spirit in this entrepreneurship spirit very much in people's but also these during maybe not during last decade, but starting from maybe 30 years ago, 25 years ago, this spirit is developing. People accumulating some, they accumulating capital, they accumulating knowledge, they accumulating how to do business internationally, and they are learning how to produce, sell. I just try to touch that. We have some cities, for example, Gaziantep. It's in Anatolia. We have Konya, we have Kayseri. They produce almost everything, and they sell all over the world. But I think in terms of culture, I should here maybe I should mention that in the government I know many people who were managing this process. I worked with 3 economy ministers when I was CEO of a public bank in Ankara, and I know everybody in the bureaucracy, economic bureaucracy, top bureaucracy. I think the hardest thing is not to know what to do. The hardest thing is to take the decision to change things and to take things from here to there. The hardest thing is not to know, what the right thing is. The hardest thing is have the courage to carry out those changes, and I think this political stability also helped. Political leadership also helped to carry out all those things. Mr. Erdogan or AK Party, okay, Mr. Erdogan is a very political figure, but his economy team, they're not like politicians. They're more like technicians. You know what I mean? I think this helped a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Abdullah. Jeff, enlighten us.
Well, I don't know. Really, I love Turkey. I've been to Turkey many times. I don't know anything about Turkey, so I'm not gonna I'm not going to try with these other colleagues here and all the expertise in the audience. I just say three things about culture and entrepreneurship at a very general level, Darius. It seems to me that if you unpacked it, entrepreneurship flourishes, at a very surface level, most where the regulatory environment is most conducive, right? I mean, people need freedom, and people need opportunity, and a minimum of red tape to start things and try things and succeed. Second of all, there's of course an attitude that has something to do with how a culture or a nation or a society or community face questions of risk and also of failure, because to be good at that sort of stuff you have to be able to try it and then fail and then not be stigmatized and try it again, get another loan, and ultimately succeed. And then last, I'll venture a very broad observation, Dariush, about culture, and I'm going to speculate that entrepreneurship probably flourishes most in societies where this very human universal trait of envy is weakest. And I don't know enough about Turkey to make any clever observations, but I'll make a very general observation about Europe and the United States for good reasons of religion and history and experience. The United States and U.S. Americans and Europeans have always had a different relationship to risk, liberty, and as I say, envy, best characterized by this anecdote I once heard about a British tourist in Florida who was sitting in some cafe and drinking a coffee, and up comes the young fellow serving the coffee, 20 years old, jeans and a t-shirt, bringing him his bill, and off the coast is a big, beautiful, white, spectacular sailboat. And the British guest looks out and says, "My God," pardon my language, "that bastard, how did he get that?" At the very same time, the young American was saying, "My God, one day I'm going to have one of those." Culture.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think questions like that are hard to answer, but let me try. So I alluded to something like that in my talk, that the belief, of course, it's very hard to generalize when you're talking about society or a group of people in general, that Middle Eastern societies tend to be sort of, collective, if you will, societies, if I can, contrast them to sort of individualistic societies, where the common good, you work or strive to make your family or make your society better, not necessarily sort of yourself. You can take a bullet for the team or your family, and of course, definitely there's something to be said to that. There's a lot, there are clear positives in this respect. Common good, not having a sort of selfish sort of attitude. But there's something also to be said for being an individualistic, sort of culture, and challenging the status quo and not accepting it or being different or having a unique sort of view of things or of society in general, what's important. And certainly today, the general statement, it's fair to say that these examples are not really sort of celebrated or sort of accepted and often criticized. That there's certain narrative or certain approach of looking at things that, there's a certain level of conformance that people sort of expect if you're actually growing in sort of in countries like that. I think again, I'm no expert on Turkey, but this tends to be less sort of in Turkey. And it's hard to say, it's sort of maybe it's a circle. It's hard to say whether this is a cause or an effect. Success happens, people are more encouraged to challenge sort of things, and they are more confident. So it's hard to say whether it's, as I said, it's a cause or an effect. But certainly, we're, just being an observer, we're certainly seeing less and less of this sort of collective nature that I talk about. And just watching, the newer generations in Egypt who kind of started or participated or fueled the revolution, the generations of the 80s and the 90s, I don't think we have to do anything. I think it's already there. So, the newer generations, the future, they definitely are much less conformant than my generation of the 70s or the 60s or the 50s. And it's not something I think that we need, of course, I think we need to encourage it, but it's already happening. And we're going to see the outcome of that in the next, 10, 20 years. I think it's a positive thing, and it's definitely not calling for abolishing or distancing ourselves from our heritage. But there's definitely something to be said for being open-minded and challenging the status quo. And this sort of change in culture, if you will, I think of it as something positive. And I think there's something to learn there from the Turkish model in that respect.
All right, on that happy note, I would like to extend my gratitude to all of you for your excellent presentations, and we move on to the next panel.